Hi everybody, here we are again. It's the 9th Sunday since we went online and I'm really missing meeting you all in person, but we're still gonna be online for a couple of weeks. So make sure to go to our YouTube channel and subscribe or follow us on Instagram, whatever media you prefer, but do keep posted, keep updated, and we're gonna keep on feeding you with this material and with these videos until we're able to meet at the church. And today we have the pleasure of hearing again from Wally Cirafesi. He's going to continue on our Enduring Presence series. So let's hear what he has to tell us.
Hello everyone, my name is Wally Cirafesi, as Maikon just mentioned. It's good to be with you again, although of course we're doing this whole online thing now. I echo Maikon's comments that it would be much better to be with you in person, to get to share with you and see and shake hands and those kinds of things, but of course we can't do that yet. So look forward to the day that we are able to do that. This time together that I have with you is a continuation of our Enduring Presence series. Maikon last week shared a little bit with you about sort of a bigger picture on the question of suffering, why we suffer, what kind of answers does the Bible provide or not provide us with, and this week we're going to continue in the vein of suffering, but on a different level. And so what I want to share with you today has to do with this topic of experiencing the enduring presence of God in everyday life suffering. And the passage that we're going to look into a bit today is Mark chapter 5, verses 25 through 34. And that passage has parallels in the Gospel of Matthew. So if you want to look over at Matthew, that's chapter 9, verses 20 through 22. And Luke chapter 8, verses 43 through 48. And so all three of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, cover this story that we're going to look into. And we'll go ahead and read it here in just a second. But the focus of our text, our focus text, is going to be from the Gospel of Mark. Okay, so let me go ahead and read that for us. I'll start with a couple of verses before verse 25. This is just to kind of give us a nice even start here. We'll start in chapter 5, verse 21, and then go through verse 34. Okay, and I'm reading from the New International Version. So the text reads, "When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, 'My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live.' So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she had heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, 'If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed.' Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, 'Who touched my clothes?' 'You see the people crowding against you?' His disciples answered, 'And yet you can ask, who touched me?' But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering.'" So this is God's word, and we are thankful for it. Get situated here. Giving a message on this topic of the enduring presence of God, experiencing the enduring presence of God in our everyday suffering is as you could imagine, a bit of a daunting task these days. Many people are suffering right now, all around the world, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. In some cases, this is all we can talk about these days is COVID-19, the coronavirus. Many are suffering in their bodies because they are sick. Many are suffering in their mind, in their soul, because of the stress of isolation, the fear of an uncertain future, or the anxiety of a bleeding bank account. So while the COVID-19 crisis puts a spotlight on our experiences of suffering, especially these days, in many ways suffering could be said to be a fundamental part of our everyday human experience, whether or not we're in the midst of a global pandemic, a global health crisis. In fact, we don't even need to be experiencing pain necessarily to be suffering. In a really interesting book, a very helpful book, I think, written by Gerald Peterman and Andrew Smutzer, called Between Pain and Grace. It's a biblical theology of suffering. They draw a distinction, actually, in their book between pain on the one hand and suffering on the other. And they point to some recent research by a couple of doctors Betty Farrell and Nessa Coyle, who suggest that suffering results when the most important aspects of a person's identity are either threatened or lost. So suffering is actually not identical to being in pain. It's certainly related to it, but not necessarily directly. Suffering can exist without pain, and pain is only indirectly related to suffering. So for example, when our dreams of a cherished future goal are dashed, when our relationships are strained or severed, when we're crushed by the fear of losing our jobs, when our children are sick or we're racked with guilt that we can't give them the energy or attention that we want to give them, which I think many of us who have kids these days are feeling especially, or when we interpret a physical injury as a loss of our identity. All of these things are examples, and there are much more, of course, that represent our everyday suffering. So when we turn to our story in the Gospel of Mark about an unnamed woman who for 12 years had a bleeding disorder, whether it was what we know today as hemophilia or von Willebrand's disease, we see a woman presented primarily in her suffering, not necessarily her pain, even though pain is probably most certainly a part of her experience, whether it's acute pain or chronic pain over a stretch of 12 years of this bleeding disorder. But she's presented mostly in her experience of suffering. It's significant that only Mark's version of this story, so as I mentioned, Matthew has a version and Luke has a version as well, but only in Mark's version of this story is it mentioned that the woman was in a state of suffering. Some English translations of Matthew actually, they do include the word suffering to describe the woman's bleeding there, but that's actually not a word in the original text, the original Greek text. Mark actually uses the word suffering. But what's so interesting to me about it is that he doesn't connect her suffering directly to her experience of bleeding, but rather to her experience under the care of doctors who did nothing but drain her bank account. So from my perspective, the text seems to present the woman certainly with some sort of physical pain, but a physical pain that has led to the result of a long-lasting, day-to-day economic suffering. She's destitute. She doesn't have anything left. She spent all that she could to try to get well again. Standing behind this text also is the fact that she's also been suffering in her social relationships for 12 years. As a Jewish woman, according to the law of Moses, especially we can see this in Leviticus 15:25, the woman's bleeding would result in a status of uncleanness for as many days as her bleeding continued. Now, within an ancient Jewish context, being unclean is not necessarily a big deal. Every time a man emitted semen or a woman menstruated or gave birth, there's a number of other kinds of situations, he or she would be considered unclean for a period of time. After performing certain rituals, usually some sort of bathing or washing or something like that, they would be pronounced clean again by the priest. So daily uncleanness was something that ancient Jews dealt with all the time. It's not necessarily a special kind of experience here. And the Mosaic Law prescribed ways to deal with uncleanness. On the other hand, even though uncleanness was just part of daily life, a daily experience that ancient Jews had to deal with all the time, being in a state of uncleanness was not necessarily desirable. As Leviticus 15:31 mentions, uncleanness has a defiling force to it. There's something that presents a situation where you can't worship the way you want to. You can't quite imagine or engage with or within the community that you're supposed to, or that you would like to, when you are unclean. You can't be touched, and nothing you sit on or lie on or drink from or eat from can be touched either, without the person touching it contracting your uncleanness as well. So there's a defiling force to it. The Mosaic Law prescribes ways to move from uncleanness to clean. That's not the major problem. What the major problem for this woman with the bleeding disorder is that she's been bleeding for 12 years. It's one thing to be unclean for a few days because you've been bleeding as part of your menstruation, or 7 days, or even up to a month or something like that under certain circumstances. That's one thing. But for 12 years, that's another. She would not have been considered a social outcast, necessarily, but she would have been living a life of extended social distancing. And of course, that term rings a bell for us these days. This is why it's so bold of her to be in a crowd in the first place, and then actually reach out to touch Jesus' clothes. She totally violates the social distancing guidelines, essentially saying, screw it, I'm going in. This Jesus might have the power to restore my identity, to restore my relationships, to heal my suffering and my pain. And this is, of course, what Jesus does. Or actually, this is what Jesus' clothes do. Unlike in the gospel stories, here Jesus does not take the initiative to heal the woman from her psychosocial torment. The woman does it. She's the one that takes initiative. But of course, Jesus does respond. In the story, Jesus is being pressed on and pushed around by a large crowd on a busy street in a relatively small village. It's not exactly clear, but it's probably the village that we know of by the name of Capernaum. He's just come across the lake from the eastern region of the Galilee, having put a deeply troubled, demon-possessed man back into his right mind. That's the story of the Gerasene demoniac. And now he's on the way to heal a little girl who is extremely close to death. The Gospel of Luke actually says she's about 12 years old. So 12 being an interesting theme that tie the stories together, the number 12. So Jesus has death and demon possession on his brain right now, and a bunch of bodies swirling around him. Yet he can feel the touch of a single person desperate to be rescued from their everyday suffering. He knows that dynamic, life-giving power that's in his body has gone out from him, but he doesn't know to whom it's gone. It's surprising, as surprising as it is to his disciples, Jesus wants to know who touched him. He knows someone did, but he doesn't know who. And so he's on the look to identify the one who touched him. And the woman gets found out. Jesus sees her, and I think that's a really important part of the text. Up to this point, she's probably, we don't know exactly, but she's weaving in and out of the crowd. Maybe she's on the ground, crawling at foot level, just trying to get close enough to touch Jesus' clothes. And Jesus sees her. He connects with her. And she's scared. She's just violated social distancing protocol, according to the law, but she's willing to fess up and tell Jesus that it was me. I touched you. In his, albeit short and sweet, engagement with her, eye to eye, locked in, Jesus never dismisses the reality of her suffering. He never says something like, "Don't worry, God will provide for you," even though maybe that's true. He never says your uncleanness, according to the law of Moses, isn't a thing, right? That's just sort of itty-bitty law kinds of things or whatever. Don't worry about that. Just worship God in spirit and truth. He doesn't say those things. He knows that her disorder and the daily suffering that it has caused her has fragmented her. It's shattered her into pieces. She can't worship God the way she wants. She can't have friends the way she wants. She can't invest in her community the way she wants. She's destitute, remember? What she needs is to be rescued. Literally, the word here is what we would typically translate into English, saved. She needs to be saved, but not from sort of in a sense maybe that we get from Paul's letters, saved from our condemnation from sin, but rather from her sense of loss. Her disorder has taken things from her, has stripped her of aspects of her identity that were crucial to her. The pieces of herself need to be put back together again. Ultimately, this is what things like poverty and disease are. They are a fragmentation of the individual, a severing of relationship. So the pieces of her need to be put back together. And this is what the power of Jesus does for her. It takes her from brokenness to completeness, wholeness, wellness, or what Jesus calls peace. So experiencing the presence of God in our everyday suffering, no matter what shape or form that suffering takes, is fundamentally about our longing for wholeness, for wellness. This longing is what I see in these two images depicting artistically our story. One's an ancient image and one's a modern one. The ancient image is from the catacombs, or a couple of catacombs from Rome, depicting the woman reaching out to Jesus. You don't get a sense of the crowd there in this ancient picture, but you do have a sense of longing on her face. I don't know if you can tell from the image in this, but her face is, the trajectory of her face is slightly down, but her eyes are looking up, right? So she's dejected, she's ashamed, but she's longing. She wants something from Jesus. She's just touching the outer tips of his coattails while Jesus reaches down and welcomes her. The modern image is a beautiful painting from the Duke and Altum Chapel in current day. Well, it's current day Magdala on the Lake of Galilee, but it's an ancient site. There's lots of archaeology there and all that kind of stuff. But in the chapel that's been established there's a really beautiful painting. Unfortunately, I forget the name of the artist. I should have that here. But it's a beautiful picture of this story. Here, the artist depicts the woman as kind of hovering around the feet of the crowd, and she barely, just with her finger, touches Jesus, and you see that spark of power coming out from him. And so it's this sense of loss, the sense of dejection, sense of loss of identity especially, but reaching out in faith, asking, longing for the power of Jesus to make one whole again. This longing for wholeness, ultimately, I think, transcends our pain. Pain is very real, and pain can be painful. But our longing for wholeness, I think, transcends that. And ultimately, this longing for wholeness finds its expression, its fulfillment, really, in loving relationship, both with God and those around us, with our community. So, as we continue to struggle through our current times in our own contexts, I think all of us have different ones, and as we abide by certainly our health guidelines that our leaders have set out for us, I encourage you to invite the power of Jesus into your everyday life through faith. And that looks differently for all of us. There's no one way that happens. But let the power of Jesus permeate your relationships, whether those relationships are in person, maybe we're getting a little bit more of those these days, or through a computer screen. And always remember that the remedy for our sense of loss, when we feel fragmented and severed and shattered, the vaccine for our suffering, so to say, are the gentle words of Jesus. Go in peace and be well from your affliction. Thanks.
Go in peace and be well from your affliction, Jesus said to the woman. And I say to you today also, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you, upon your life. May the Lord turn his face towards each and every one of you and give you peace. Go in peace and serve the Lord joyfully.